Let's just dive right in. You know that feeling, right? When you're in a conversation and it just completely goes off the rails? You feel like you're talking to someone from another planet. Well, it turns out a lot of the time, that kind of miscommunication goes way deeper than just the words we're using. It's actually about the fundamental structure of how we think.
Yeah, it is so common. You're both speaking English, you're using the same vocabulary, but the meaning just isn't connecting? So what if the problem isn't what you're saying, but how your brain is wired to process the information in the first place?
You know, this whole idea really kicked off when a Chinese student said this to his professor, Richard Nisbet. He said, "You think the world is a line, and I think it is a circle." And that one simple, brilliant observation just opened up a whole new way of understanding how cultures think. And that's the big idea we're going to unpack today. Do you see the world as a straight line or as an interconnected circle?
So let's get into why this actually matters in our everyday lives. Because these aren't just some abstract academic concepts. No, they create real, genuine confusion and friction at work, at home, pretty much everywhere.
Okay, check out this example from Thailand. A missionary named Carl Dalfred noticed that when someone from Thai culture says yes, it doesn't always mean a final locked-in decision. It's more like a preliminary agreement. A yes, we're on the right track, but it's still connected to a bunch of other factors. For a linear thinker who just wants a definite answer, that could be totally confusing. And that brings us to the two big categories that researchers use to describe these different ways of thinking. They're called analytic and holistic thinking. Let's break down exactly what they mean.
First up, we've got analytic thinking. This is your classic, straight as an arrow, cause and effect logic. You know, A leads to B, which leads to C. It's all about applying universal rules, and it tends to pull things out of their context. The basic idea is, if you know the rules, you can figure out what's going to happen, no matter the situation.
And then, on the complete other side, you have holistic thinking. This approach is all about context, relationships, the whole web of connections. It's less like a straight line and more like a spiral or ripples in a pond. A decision isn't just one singular event, it's something that sends waves through the entire system. You really can't understand one piece of the puzzle without seeing the whole picture.
Now, this chart is super helpful for seeing them side by side. So, for example, look at causal inference. An analytic thinker might see someone do something and think, well, that's just their personality. That's called dispositional. It's inherent to them. But a holistic thinker is much more likely to look at the same action and think, what's going on in their situation that made them do that? One zeroes in on the object, the other pans out to see the entire context.
All right, to make this all a bit more concrete, we've got a really cool thought experiment. It's an AI-generated dialogue between three legendary detectives, all facing the famous trolley problem. It's a fantastic way to see how these different ways of thinking tackle a really tough moral choice.
First, we have the original 19th century Sherlock Holmes. He is pure analytic, linear thinking. For him, this isn't even a dilemma, it's just math. He applies a universal rule, save more lives, and bam, case closed. It's all about the cold, hard logic, not the messy human details.
Then we get the modern Sherlock from the BBC show. He represents that holistic, non-linear style, and he immediately throws the moral calculus out the window. Instead, he focuses on the story, the consequences. For him, the question isn't what's the right answer, it's who do I become if I make this choice? The act of choosing changes everything.
And finally, we have the fictional Chinese detective Judge D. He brings in a third way, called dialectical thinking. This is really common in holistic cultures, and it's all about finding a middle way. It's not about choosing A or B. It's about finding a solution that preserves harmony and balances all the competing values. He's asking a totally different kind of question.
And here's the kicker. At the end of the dialogue, nobody pulls the lever. The problem isn't solved, and that's the whole point. The experiment doesn't give us an answer. It shows us the value in each way of seeing the world. Linear logic gives us clarity, holistic thinking gives us context, and dialectical thinking pushes us to find harmony. None of them is better than the others. They're just profoundly different.
Okay, that detective story is pretty cool. But how does this stuff actually show up in the real world? Let's shift gears and look at a super practical example. How these different logical styles affect the way we teach and learn.
Let's imagine two different Bible studies, both looking at the exact same story, Jesus and the Samaritan woman from the Gospel of John. The text is identical, but the way they approach it, their underlying logic, totally changes the goal. One is trying to reach a neat conclusion. The other is trying to create an experience, an encounter. So the linear study follows this clear step-by-step path. It's like climbing a ladder. You start by establishing a need, you follow the dialogue, you clarify the tricky parts, and you climb up step by step until you reach a final theological point. A leads to B, leads to C. It's a really clean, logical process.
The holistic study, though, moves more like a spiral. It starts with the initial encounter. Then it explores a central image, like living water. And then it circles back to ideas like worship and recognition, but each time going a little deeper. The goal isn't to get to the top of the ladder and be done, it's to deepen the relational experience with every loop of the spiral.
So, what does all this mean for us, right now and for the future? Well, with the explosion of things like digital media and artificial intelligence, there's a huge debate going on about whether our fundamental way of thinking is changing, and whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. On one side of the debate, you have people like James Marriott. He argues that as we move away from deep reading, which is what really builds that linear, analytic muscle, we're at risk. He's worried that without that kind of structured logic, the very foundations of our civilization could start to crumble. But then you have this powerful counterargument from the scholar Walter Ong. He made it super clear that nonlinear thinking, which is really common in oral cultures, isn't primitive or simplistic at all. It's just different. It's capable of producing its own forms of incredibly complex, intelligent, and beautiful thought. And this right here is what makes this so relevant today. Think about our world. It's all about AI, big data, global supply chains. These are all deeply nonlinear systems. They force us to see the whole picture, not just the individual parts. And honestly, this shift can create a lot of tension in fields that were built on straight-line thinking, like management or even science. But it's also where all the new opportunities are. Holistic thinking isn't a step backward. It's actually a necessary upgrade for navigating the crazy complexity of our world. So, as we wrap this up, let's bring it back to you. I want you to think about your own experience. When you're trying to solve a problem, what's your go-to move? Do you look for the rule, for that straight line from A to B? Or do you start by mapping out all the relationships in the context? Just knowing your own default style is a huge first step.
And here's a little experiment you can actually try. Take an email or a presentation you've written and pop it into an AI tool. Ask it to rewrite it in the opposite style. So if it's a list of bullet points, ask the AI to turn it into a compelling story. If it's a narrative, ask it for a logical step-by-step summary. It's a really cool way to see what changes and what new insights you might get.
And finally, maybe the most important question of all, how well do you really understand the thinking styles of the people you interact with every day? Because the next time you hit one of those communication roadblocks, just pause for a second and ask yourself, wait, am I thinking in a line while they're thinking in a circle? Understanding their logic isn't just an interesting little fact. It might just be the most important key to communicating better in our complex, amazing, interconnected world.